Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the 2021 Sherman Lecture sponsored by the Association of Canadian Deans of Education. My name is Dr. Sharon Wall, and I have the privilege of being the president of ACDE. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are presently situated upon many traditional and ancestral lands and territories. Let us take a moment to reflect on the many generations of elders, knowledge keepers, and caretakers of these lands, and to give thanks for the privilege that we have of living on these lands. At this time, as our country is reeling from the tragic discovery at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, I would like to quote ACDE's response to the TRC's call to action that was published in 2017. And I quote, "We are reminded of our duty to recognize the many ways in which education was used as a tool of assimilation and oppression of Indigenous peoples, and to acknowledge our ethical responsibility as a collective representing educational institutions and those responsible for the preparation of educators in Canada to work to include truth and reconciliation in all educational spheres in which our members engage," end quote. I urge all of us to reflect on this statement and to pledge to continue towards fulfilling our responsibilities for these calls to action. Today, I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to Dr. Niigaan Sinclair. Niigaan is an Anishinaabe from Little Peguis, which is in Treaty 1 territory near Selkirk, Manitoba. He is a scholar and a writer based in Winnipeg. He is a regular commentator on Indigenous issues for CTV, CBC, and APTN, and his critical and creative work can be found in books such as the Exile edition of Native Canadian fiction and drama, newspapers like The Guardian, and online with CBC Books Canada Writes. He is also the co-editor of 3 award-winning collections, Centering Anishinaabeg Studies, Understanding the World Through Stories, Manitowapow, Aboriginal Writings from the Land of Water, and The Winter We Danced, Voices of the Past, the Future. Dr. Sinclair teaches courses in Indigenous literatures, cultures, histories, and politics, and is a proud Treaty 1 member. He considers himself to be a recovering high school teacher. In my mind, there is no better person to speak to us on this topic than Dr. Sinclair. I've had an opportunity to watch a couple of Niigaan's speeches on YouTube. He is passionate and articulate and incredibly engaging. Very shortly, I will turn the microphone for this lecture to our Sherman lecturer for this year. Before I do, though, I would like to make a note that this lecture is named for a former ACDE member, Dr. Anne Sherman, who was my predecessor at the University of New Brunswick. Anne was one of the authors of our current Accord on Indigenous Education and was passionate in her efforts to support and learn from our Indigenous colleagues. Anne passed away far too soon in 2017. I did not have the privilege of meeting Anne, but I am so grateful that ACDE members have chosen to honor her legacy through this annual lecture series. Dr. Sinclair will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Niigaan, the microphone is yours.
Okay, so bonjour Indigenous Magaraduk. Niigaan we with Indigenous cost, Namago Shindo Dem, Niman Wendam Omayan. Karabach Bangi Ziguan Aguijing, bonjour Nimisho Masak, the Komisak, Mishana Gijek, Nimiji Nibekwe. Anishinaabe and Dow, Bungie, Peguis, and Donchi. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share with you a little bit of space here. And I can see some great friends who are in the room. So I just want to shout out to them. I can see that I feel like this is romper room, whatever you call people out. You're like, and I see Melanie Jansen from my good friend Melanie. I also see I also see Dr. Hare is on the call here, so I have great respect for you, Dr. Hare. I don't think we've met very much when I was at UBC, but it's very honorable to see you. If it weren't for you, I would have had a very big problem in my dissertation. So thank you so much for all your work. And I was at UBC, of course, and appreciate all the work that you do over there. So, and I think Jerome is somewhere coming. He's either coming or he's going to be here or something like that. But anyways, it's Jerome Cranston, who's a very good friend of mine as well. We're all kind of affiliated through the University of Manitoba, but it's a pleasure to be here. It's honorable for me to to be able to share a little bit of space with you and to share this time with you on what has been a very heavy day since I've gotten up this morning. We've been very hard at work on the column involving the Kamloops Residential School. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute because I'm a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. I'm going to share my slides here, and in a very professorial kind of, boring, hopefully not too boring kind of way, I've got a bunch of images that I'm going to show you for today. And, I don't mean for this to be classroom-like. I know this is an official big-time lecture, probably one of the biggest lectures I've ever been a part of. So I'm very honored and appreciate this deeply. However, I just can't get away from doing images. I just have slides. So I hope you can appreciate that as well. I know this is being recorded as well, and we're for future publications. So me watch for that and for this time. This is stuff that I do. I'm an Indigenous scholar who works on my own territory. I'm trained through the University of British Columbia, previously the University of Oklahoma, which at the time were the only two real programs I could attend, University of Oklahoma in particularly, because it was the only Indigenous literature program in North America. And continues to be one of the very few. And being an Indigenous scholar, there's lots of different parts, and I can't step away from taking this opportunity when I'm speaking to deans to tell you two things. One is that to be an Indigenous scholar is the hardest role in universities, and I'd say that with deep respect to everybody who works in universities, but nobody is demanded upon like we are in terms of this time period that we live in of this reconciliation era, if that's what we want to call it. No one is required to do more committee work, to do more reading, to do more consultation and public work, because we're not just expected to teach our students, but our colleagues and often the administration at the same time. No other professor is expected to be an advocate and an activist and an academic all at the same time, because it's not just you who expects these things. It's also the community, it's also the media, it's also the public at large that expects us to do these roles. Psychology professors don't have to do that. If they do it, it's an anomaly. As an Indigenous professor, you are expected to be able to do this, to have an opinion on sports logos at the same time as you do with talking about the recent revelations involving young women who their child workers advocated for doctors to insert in IUDs in young Indigenous women up to the age of 10. Like, we're expected to have opinions on a wide array of subjects like no other professor is expected. So, when we're in these roles, I would be remiss for me to not take this opportunity to say as deans is to be aware that as an Indigenous professor, you've got somebody who's dedicated on several different levels and working at the institutional basis for many different times. And our activity report looks different than the rest of our faculties. When we often consider service as the third in a role of teaching, research, and service is somehow the third place. That is the most Indigenous work of all. That's why you hired us. And so oftentimes deeming that as lesser than work is exactly to undermine Indigenous inclusion within your university. So these are important things worth talking about. This is just a few examples of things that I do. Here I am at the World Court right here talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, talking in a macro way. International court, lawyers, judges across the world. Right here, that same week, though, I'm also talking at Nietzsche Commons in downtown Winnipeg to people who are in poverty. I mean, how are we going to, be able to talk about housing? Or we're going to talk about, residential school survivors sleeping in tent cities in downtown. And I work with a street level organization called Mama Bear Clan, and we go out every Sunday. In fact, I'm going out in about 3 hours to go and feed our relatives and offer a smudge and offer kindness, which are the things that Canada has offered the least to residential school survivors, which is kindness. And so to offer kindness is to truly be revolutionary. Now, this was my graduating class at UBC, and I'm not alone. Like, I'm certainly not an anomaly. There are those of us all across doing those micro conversations, and we're also parents at the same time. Like, I could list off all my qualifications, but really, this is what I'm the proudest of. I'm proudest of this. I'm proudest of the fact that I get to work in my own territory. I get to engage and talk and have a conversation with people who I grew up with, people who I'm closest with, people who I'm related to, and sometimes in which we talk about academics, we talk about objectivity. For Indigenous people, subjectivity is the only objectivity. Subjectivity is the positioning in which you place yourself within a community setting. And what's often referred to as bias or opinions or whatever else our research gets called that week, service, we are the academics that are most needed by universities. We are the ones who are most needed at this time into the future. And it's important to identify that, because when I'm talking about deans, when I'm talking to deans, leaders, it is deans who make the decisions on universities. And someone way back in the day decided to certify teachers, to certify institutions, to support those institutions, and to engage in a process of indoctrinating and assimilating and unfortunately performing some of the most egregious acts against this country's most vulnerable. It is leaders like yourself who have been put into power to be able to place and make decisions, not just that instituted systems like this, what we're seeing in Kamloops, but also for those of us who now have to figure out, how do we inherit this? What do we do about it? And that's what I really want to talk about for a few minutes here. And I want to honor the legacy of my relatives. When the report came out on Thursday about the 215 children who were found buried on the grounds of the Kamloops residential school, like, that's not new. Like, people have known about that particular space, people buried in the earth there since the 2000s. That was funded from the Aboriginal Commemorative Fund, which is through the NCTR. That is a report that was handed out, or that was issued, that was calls from the community to investigate the territory and the spaces in that territory. Like, that's not new. That wasn't discovered a week ago or a month ago. That was discovered 2 decades ago. They've been searching that lands for 2 decades. If you just excuse me, my window is getting a bit loud here, so Nibby's going to have to give you a little bit upset, but sorry, Nibby. I know. And so when we talk about it, the only thing that's really unthinkable about this situation is the fact that Canadians haven't thought about it. We have been thinking about these situations for a very long period of time. And in my column tomorrow, which is a moment of shameless self-promotion, I apologize, but in the Winnipeg Free Press, I talk about the reports at the TRC and the fact that the TRC, even though it wasn't in their mandate to find cemeteries, asked the federal government back in 2014 and were refused to investigate cemeteries across the country. In fact, there was an internal report which is being released in about 2 hours. I have a copy of it. We talked about it in my column, which talks about the hotspots and the cemeteries that are unmarked graves throughout the country. Newsflash, there are hundreds. There are hundreds. In fact, I wrote about a burial ground, a burial space, an unmarked burial space in Brandon, Manitoba, the Brandon Residential School. I wrote about this a couple of years ago, where you have probably dozens of Indigenous children, but we don't know because that burial ground has been cemented over with a trailer park. That's exactly the kind of legacies that we have here. And we think back to what happened at the Kamloops school specifically, and let's talk a little bit about what happened at the Kamloops school to give you a little bit of knowledge. This was a letter that Reverend O'Grady, Fergus O'Grady, wrote to parents back in 1948. And what he said was, it's a privilege for me to send your children back to you, but you must follow 2 rules. The first is you have to pay for the transportation of your own children. And second is you have to bring the children back on time. And then he threatens them at the end of the letter and says that if you don't bring the children back, then we won't be doing this Christmas visit anymore. Someone somewhere decided to put Fergus O'Grady in charge of this university, of this school. And of course, as a Catholic priest, he was embodied in missions with Indigenous peoples. He also was the leader of the school at Williams Lake. So he not only expanded this school to involve secondary, but he also was leader of the school at Williams Lake. In fact, he was the first bishop of Prince George. And so someone had to make a decision for that. And then on top of that, It wasn't just that he did those and spread missionization projects through Prince George, but then in 1986, upon his retirement, received an honorary doctorate from the University of British Columbia, the same school that I spoke about at the beginning, which is certifying arguably some of the most Indigenous students in history. That's 1986. And we say to ourselves, well, that's 1986, different time period and everything like that. This is a newsletter issued in 2017, where the Catholics in Prince George still call Fergus O'Grady as a man of vision. They also say that he was the priest, if you can see right here, priests who served with Bishop O'Grady describe his vision as a path to the right solution. And if you take down here, they say that he was incapable of talking down to anyone. Well, I suppose anyone except for Indigenous parents, who he said it was a privilege for you to spend time with your children. Now, we may think to ourselves, this is a man of his time. We may think to ourselves, this is, UBC would have honored somebody who did a lot of work in the community, and apparently he enjoyed BC history. And we may say even that, well, that's his home parish. What else are they going to say? How many more excuses do we need to make before we realize that the epidemic of violence and genocide against Indigenous peoples isn't just over, but it is only recently being spoken about? And I think that Canadians, the reason why this story is so important is not because of the realization that it's children, but the realization that Canadians have a country in which they are not prepared to have a conversation about. They're not trained to. They haven't thought about these conversations. One of the things I often say about people who work in areas involving Indigenous peoples is that we've been having this conversation for a very long period of time as Indigenous peoples. Arguably hundreds of years, 500 years for sure, where we've been talking about treaties. We've been talking about relationships. We've been talking about sharing the land, sharing the resources. Canadians have not had this conversation. They are not ready for this conversation. They are not conditioned by universities, trained and who trains the teachers, who trains the Canadians to have this conversation. The biggest epidemic of this country is that silence has become the order of the day. Silence insofar that it's resulted in the erasure of cemeteries, silence in the awarding of individuals of honorary degrees, and silence in the ways that it continues to indemnify itself in every aspect of our society. Let's end the silence. Let's end the silence, and let's take action together to create a country better than that we've inherited. This right here is Kakawakanabe. I want to talk to you a little bit about this guy, this individual, this leader. He's Anishinaabe, and he's from the Mississauga of the New Credit. Now, I happen to do my master's degree on Kakawakanabe. He's a remarkable man. He is the first Ojibwe to write in English, publish in English. He's not the first to publish a book, though. That's actually George Copway, one of his students. But Kakawakanabe published most of his work in missionary journals and so on because he was a missionary. He was a Methodist missionary. And he chose in 1823 to do something remarkable, which was to convert. And he didn't choose to convert, though, because he saw Christianity as better. He converted because he needed to eat. He needed his family to eat. He needed his community to eat and have their lands protected, also have access to opportunity. Because opportunity was the one thing that was being stolen from Kakawakanabe and the Anishinaabe of Southern Ontario. The War of 1812 was a brutal time for Anishinaabe. The War of 1783 was pretty bad. That was, of course, the American Revolutionary War, where post 1763, where the king says everything is mine, the Royal Proclamation that results in the 13 colonies breaking away, the American Revolutionary War, the situation of Hamilton, if you watch the musical. And then following that, though, the refugees that came back following the Revolutionary War, and then following the War of 1812, when British North America and the United States battled, resulted in a flooding of Anishinaabe territory in Southern Ontario from mostly refugees. British, Scottish, other allies, Indigenous allies as well, Haudenosaunee, Potawatomi, Odawa, yes, even some from deep south who didn't want to live under the Americans. And so the Anishinaabe suffered tremendously as a result of the flooding of their territories, to the tune of 90% population loss. Most of that was due to starvation and also from sickness that comes from starvation. One of the biggest lies I was ever told in my entire life was about grade 5, where I heard the story, and the famous story that's still percolating around, which is that Indigenous peoples are somehow susceptible to European diseases. That's not true. It's like residential school. It's like saying people were starving, people got tuberculosis in residential school. They didn't get tuberculosis without starvation. Starvation makes the immune system weak. It is because of starvation, interruption of food lines, particularly the fact that Toronto pops up overnight, Guelph, Windsor, Hamilton, these places pop up, interrupts the food distribution routes, the food access routes, and that leads to sickness. That's what leads to smallpox epidemics. So Indigenous peoples were not susceptible to European disease. In fact, if you look at the Cree on the plains, strongest, longest lifespan, strongest bone structure, teeth structure, like James Dashik writes about that in the book Clearing the Plains. You can read it up if you wish. But Indigenous peoples were incredibly healthy, but with the interruption of food lines leads to starvation and then sickness. And that's what happened to Kakawakanabe. He was literally watching an apocalypse before his very eyes. His family, the elders and the warriors in his community were beginning to become addicted to alcohol to cope with the massive death around them, as well as the undermining of governmental systems as a result of colonialism within Southern Ontario, accessing, undermining, infusing it with whiskey and so on. And the bottom line was that Kakawakanabe saw the possibility that Anishinaabe were going to come to an end. And he saw any means necessary, which was converting to Christianity, because he didn't think Christianity was better. He thought Christianity offered opportunity. I want you to remember that, because opportunity is what I'm going to talk to you about today when we talk about reconciliation. Because if we understand opportunity, we're going to understand what people like Kakawakanabe back in the 1830s and people like myself in 2021 are seeking. Opportunity is the issue. It's not potential. Opportunity is the issue. Now, as we talk about Kakawakanabe, we can't deny that, there's a big method here in that he sought schooling. Schooling was his method in which he saw that opportunity lying. He saw that Christianity offered this opportunity for food, of course, access to resources, access to goods, to be seen on the merits of humans, which is his big argument in his life. Goes around talking to other, Christians, Methodists and otherwise, and says, your Bible says that all people are humans. Maybe we should treat people like humans and not just stomp on their territory, squat on their territory, steal their territory. Not just simply murder and undermine and infuse those communities with whiskey, for example. You frequently would make those arguments as well. And one of the things that he would most markedly say is that Christians don't act like Christianity tells you to act. The problem with Christianity, as he says, is the Christians. And that might be an important message when we think about Father O'Grady or Reverend O'Grady, is that the problem with Christianity is that Christians don't often read about their own faith, and they don't think about their own faith or what their faith says. And that's what Peter Jones said. He was interested far more in the Christianity in the book than he was in the way Christianity was lived by Christians. And so one of the things that he said was we need to bring schooling into our communities. And yes, at times the Bible, because it is those messages of love, hope, kindness, generosity that live within the Bible that might just be the biggest thing that speak to Anishinaabe. Because Anishinaabe are good, kind, active people, and we'll talk about Anishinaabe in just a minute of who we are. But one of the things that he did is he would often record his experiences in schools to argue for more schools. He went all the way to England, for example, to argue for schools. And this is the very first recorded Indigenous person talking about schooling and what he seeks from schooling. Remember, like I said before, the very first Indigenous person to write in English in this country. Okay, so here's what he said. One day he's in a school and he witnesses this particular situation. He says, "It makes the heart of the poor Indian rejoice to see his child read in a book, to see him put the talk to paper, to see the talk go to a distance. That makes him rejoice. I will give you one instance. At the River Credit, we have a station. A chief had a son who was instructed in our mission school after he was employed as a teacher in another school. and went away more than 100 miles from his father. After a time, he wrote a letter to his father in the Indian tongue, which he did not know how to read. The father brought it to me to read for him, and while I read, the tears ran down his eyes, and he rejoiced to hear the talk of his son on the paper at a distance. This is the most Anishinaabe story I can ever tell you. This is right up there with any sacred Atazukonic or Debajamoanak I could tell you, because this is a story about Anishinaabe. This is a story about two Anishinaabe guys, father and a son, with an Anishinaabe teacher or an advocate or an activist, an Anishinaabe who's recording the event, who translates the letter, which is written in Anishinaabe Moan, not English. It's later translated by Peter Jones. So like, there's nothing here about that's referring to colonialism. Like, we can't say, oh, well, this is like a story about converted Indians, talking about how to sell out their people. No, this has nothing to do with that. This has everything to do with Anishinaabe, talking about Anishinaabe things, living their Anishinaabe lives. Fully, absolutely, authentically. Because here we go, we're talking about Peter Jones recording this later for in his missionary records. But what he's saying is he's saying, through the act of writing Anishinaabe Moan from a son to a father, and the ability that I can read it, I can create relationship, and that it might be supportive for them to be able to write on their own, to be able to, through schooling, to be able to read on their own. Notice he doesn't point out English. He says the language, Anishinaabe Moan. He says that schooling should bring Anishinaabe together. Relationships. And that is the number one thing that schooling, residential schooling in particular, attacked, which was relationships. And we could talk about that in many different ways, the ways in which sisters and brothers were forced to live apart, the ways in which people weren't allowed to have relationships with each other through the language, the ways that people were forcibly removed from their community. The number one thing that schooling has done and continues to do today, in fact, what I often point out with schooling today, is remove people from their families. Literally, you have to go, right? One of the interesting things about this pandemic is my daughter's done schooling in our house. So I'm far more aware of her schooling and what she's learning and able to help that than I ever have been before. Second is that children are being asked to move from the land, sit on desks, never go outside, separate your body from the land itself. And probably the most impactful of what I'm going to talk about today, to graduate, to succeed as an Indigenous person, you are encouraged to do everything possible to not go back to your community, to not speak your language, and to succeed in all non-Indigenous ways than you are in anything else. Let me show you what I mean by that. The future that Peter Jones saw was that schools could be relationship building mechanisms. And that would be where Anishinaabe would see the future. That's why the tears rolled down the father's cheek, because he could see the future. And the future was that his son loves him through that letter, through that education, through Peter Jones witnessing. That's why he saw it was so important. And it might just be that that's what we might want to envision future schooling to be. It might just be that schooling might be about radical things like love. Schooling might be about friendship or family, or schooling could actually be about the ways that we truly are as human beings, which are relational people who are connected, people whose language and ideas and dreams connect things. Like, that would be the one thing that you see when you're with kids, right? When remember those times when you started off school and when you're a kid, and like, what are the most exciting things that you're doing when you're going to school? I can guarantee to you it's not about the curriculum. It's about, like, what's my teacher going to be like? What friends will I make? And what kind of experience will I get to play sports? That's why recess is so much fun, because it's like you're on your relational path. And it's not that classrooms aren't fun. It's just that it might just be that recess is why kids come to school. The hallways, the office, the library, and at times the classroom might also be those things too. But I want us to identify what are things going on in those spaces that might just be where education truly lies. Because I'm going to make the radical argument to you that curriculum doesn't matter. it doesn't really matter. I come from this community. My community is St. Peter's Indian Settlement, which is just north of Winnipeg. In 1907, the Government of Canada, the province of Manitoba, the town of Selkirk, forcibly removed us off the land. We were determined as uncivilized, we were savages, and we were simply moved off the land so that farmers could take our land. Even though, remarkably, our territory had been in treaty with Selkirk, the representative of the Hudson Bay Company. You can see this is the treaty right here, 1817. And we had organized into ourselves into a reserve far before almost anybody else in Western Canada. We had our own reserve. We had our own farm plots. In fact, we gave land plots or organized or negotiated land plots for Selkirk to live along the Red River. That's where all those dots come from right here. We had a system of ownership, a system of land distribution. But importantly, we didn't make it about ownership. It was about relationship. So we said, yeah, people can live along the river, but that doesn't mean we're not going to use the river. Of course, we're going to use the river. So it was a very Indigenous way of seeing treaty in the way the land is shared, 50% absolutely, totally. And that we did have our own private spaces. That's the reserve, St. Peter's Indian Settlement, just north of Winnipeg, a place called Selkirk, Manitoba, just north of Selkirk. And that's where we lived. We converted, many of us converted into Christianity. We also operated a Medewan lodge at the same place. So we were traditional and we were also Christians. We were also farmers. And we were the most successful farmers in Western Canada, far more successful than any other Indigenous or non-Indigenous community in the West. We were able to create products. We had bustling agricultural development. In fact, we were so profitable that many of the richest people along the Red River were people in our community. But yet, even though we were Christian, many of us spoke English, we still were not civilized enough. Like, what was the big dream of Canada? Was to turn Indigenous peoples into farmers. We were that. We were Canada's dream, which was that we, in many ways, fit all of the vestiges of what Canada would deem to be civilized Indians. And yet still, we were forcibly removed off the land in 1907, which tells you that it doesn't matter how much Indians learn. It doesn't matter how civilized we adopt the newcomers' ways. It doesn't matter how much English, Christianity, or time on the internet we spend. We're always just going to be savages. We're always just going to be deficient. We're always going to be inferior, period. And it really doesn't matter how much we learn. It doesn't matter how many PhDs I get. I'm still pulled over when I drive in downtown Winnipeg because I resemble a suspect. And if I dare ask that, then the ticket not only goes up, but then potential arrest happens. And tell you from firsthand experience, it really doesn't matter how many PhDs I got on my wall, because in the end of the day, if you got this ponytail and you walk around with the name Niigaan Sinclair, one time I was at the airport and I was flying to the United States and I had my passport out and I handed it to the travel agent, the guy at the border, the American guard. And he looked at my name, he looked at me and he said, "What do you want to do on my land?" And I was just like, yeah, it just never stops. That's my point. You know, when we repossess things or we reestablish our commitments to territories, this is a wonderful project by Olga Makana, which is downtown Toronto. All it simply does is put up signs. It says, you know, you are in relationship with Indigenous peoples. This is Indigenous land. These are Indigenous resources. That's what we do when we're standing in the ways of pipeline on our own territory peacefully. Notice that we've never shot first in any conflict with Canada. Indigenous peoples have never shot first. What we've always done is stand peacefully on our own territories, dancing in things like a mall, offering relationship to Canadians. Like every single time, like who do you think sends the SWAT team? Here's a hint, it's not us. The SWAT team is sent because it's so threatening. Like right now in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, laws are passed that ban demonstrations at public infrastructure. Like, who do you think that's targeting? That is targeting one group and one group only. It's Indigenous peoples. And it's proof that when it comes to Indigenous peoples telling Canadians we are in relationship, it's the most threatening possible thing in the world, peacefully. Because that is the most scariest things for Canadians to see, is that they have relationships with Indigenous peoples, that Indigenous peoples are kindly offering those relationships and want to live on their own merits. And most importantly, that we can live together, 50% in full relationship, sharing it all. That's what Indigenous peoples are most often expressing when they are demonstrating, or so-called activists, or so-called marching. What we're really doing is offering relationship, being kind, and when we look underneath the concrete, we see that this is the way life has always operated. Just because non-Native people showed up doesn't mean it's anything new. Like we spend so much time talking about what I refer to as the 5 pages of the Indigenous Encyclopedia. And that's like the last 5 pages, which is basically non-Native people show up. And then we're like, okay, here's 5 pages. We'll call that 500 years. And like, if each page is 100 years, like we still had 30,000 pages, 50,000 pages, millennia of pages before non-Indigenous people show up. But yet we obsess about those 5 pages like they're the only things that matter. They are not the only things that matter. In fact, I say that they're pretty much, we've talked enough about most of that. We continue to need to, of course, to understand, to enable, to change, but yet we obsess about it as if those 5,000, 30,000 millennia of pages don't exist, because that's where the pedagogy is. That's where the knowledge is. That's where Indigenous people's interactions are. And we just have to look underneath the concrete. Like, for example, Indigenous peoples would often move their border when they would have relationships. They would also carry multiple identities. And we had this radical idea that we take all of the medicine in our community, put it in a pile, and that those who are the sickest would take the first little bit. Or we make sure that we take all the resources, all the moose that we caught that year, we put it in a pile and say, okay, let's make sure everybody gets a little bit. We're going to make sure that when we make decisions, we're going to make sure every family, every clan comes together, picks a leader, or they have a leader in their clan system, and they go to a great meeting, and then the decision will be made for the community collectively. You know what all those things are called? Social welfare system, multiculturalism, democracy. It might just be, when we look at everything Canadian, like everything possible Canadian, from the anthem to social welfare policy, multiculturalism, healthcare, to every single policy that we consider Canadian, UN peacekeepers, the way in which the social welfare state, the idea of unemployment insurance, democracy, like all of those things, everything that is Canadian is Indigenous in its core. Like, if we, for instance, if we said to ourselves, okay, British and French people are the only people who invented things, then we'd say, well, why don't we have the feudal system here? Like, why is it that we don't have the 1% system, which kind of more and more moving towards it? But that's the feudal system, which we take everything in a pile and we give it to the king, and we keep a little scrap maybe for ourselves. Like, that's the feudal system. That's where British and French people come in. But we have these other systems in Canada, which are all Indigenous in its core. And I tell you this because that might be where we want to think about our schooling and what we are educating. Because ultimately, my argument is that everything we've ever done in schooling in this country, in terms of, all those lessons that we have in terms of standing for the national anthem, singing a song, talking about relationships, talking about the country and the crown and so on. Like, we've done all of that, but the only reason any of that is possible is because of Indigenous peoples. Like, Indigenous peoples had this idea that we have a lifelong educational process, and we'll talk about who we are, why we're here, who can help us, where we're going. That's where our creation stories come in. That's where we can talk about treaties, that where we can talk about relationships. So all of those are still there, but the problem is that we've removed Indigenous peoples from that equation, and we pretended that they don't exist. We pretended that Canadians came up with it on their own, or that British and French people were the inventors of democracy, which isn't the case at all. Indigenous peoples invented democracy, and British and French people added a few things along the way, but it is Indigenous people who came up with the idea. Same thing with multiculturalism, healthcare, exactly all of those different things. Right? One of the reasons why Peter Jones was so interested in schooling, and he was thought of as the first residential school model, because he wanted children to eat. So yes, he was interested in the system becoming a bit of a child welfare system to support communities who were suffering from the invasion of their territories. But he didn't ever, not once ever, seek to have children die in the schools. Not once. So it's interesting that when we talk about schooling, it is Indigenous peoples, our stories, our creation stories, our languages, that are the things that are often seen as the extras, right? So, because if we look at what Indigenous peoples are offering when we talk about our schooling, and of course, these are the models for the Canadian Council of Learning. So oftentimes you're like, which Indigenous people are we talking about? We talk about Inuit, Métis, First Nations. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Anishinaabe for just a moment, which fits into a First Nations holistic lifelong learning model, which, by the way, there's 640 First Nations plus, right? Ones that are just recognized, but there's other ones as well. But so like, how do we begin to define what First Nations education model we're talking about? But let's just use this model, which was designed way back in 2007. It's still a good model. It talks about how it is crucial that in order for Indigenous peoples to be able to stretch out, to branch out, meaning to learn those things that we call branching out, we'll call those, Greek myths. We'll call those, algebra. We'll call that, philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. We'll call that over. They have to be able to have access to their clan, their nation, their family, their ancestors, the natural world, traditions and ceremonies, because those are the roots. Those are the things that tell Indigenous peoples where they are, why they're here. But they're also, interestingly enough, things that tell Canadians where they are, who they're related to, where their ancestors are, who they are as their self, who they are as their nation. Like, notice how without the Indigenous story, or Indigenous content, or Indigenous whatever we want to call it this week, we'll call it reconciliation, without Canadians understanding they have foundational relationships with Indigenous peoples, we actually cut the tree off at the root. We tell Canadians that the trunk is the root. I'm far more interested in teaching Canadians that they have roots in this territory as well, and that might just be Indigenous in scope. In fact, I would say that the root of Canadians comes from an Indigenous seed. That's who they are. It's based on the very driver's license that people have, which have Indigenous names on it, or the territories in which they live, which are on Indigenous territories, which is the economy of the money that they are using, which comes from Indigenous resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It might just be that instead of teaching so much about the trunk and the branches, that if we don't teach the roots, then ultimately what we're doing is we're miseducating Canadians. I would recommend that there are 5 principles for Indigenous education that are lacking in the system. The first is that we have a perspective that Indigenous education spans every subject, every field, every area. I think one of the things that we most often misunderstand is that Indigenous education is not the humanities. In fact, if it's anything, it's the physical sciences. It's science, it's math, because you got to understand the world before you talk about it. And, Indigenous peoples are the great ecologists, botanists, physicists of creation. We're the only ones who've been studying this land for thousands of years. Like, Europeans came in, and if you believe all the other stories involving the earth is flat, like, it was Indigenous peoples who could look out in the stars and see that there was an astronomy going on, that there was a sort of a circular astronomy, a cyclical astronomy. It might just be that Indigenous peoples came up with radical concepts like the earth is round, or that Indigenous peoples have concepts of gravity, that they have concepts of ecology, of when to plant, where to go, how the water flows. So we need to stop with this idea that Indigenous education is like the humanities, that we need to somehow stick it over here in ELA or in social studies, because it's not. It actually belongs more in science and math. Second, Indigenous education includes the community. Like, for instance, one of the things that we most often have this conundrum when it comes to Indigenous education, which is the most educated Indigenous peoples are the most uncredited. Those are our elders. Those are our elders who often don't have university degrees. One of the things we've had to argue with in our department at the University of Manitoba is that, yes, Indigenous knowledge is legitimate knowledge. Therefore, it's on par with any piece of paper that I have on the wall. And that, yes, we should certify Indigenous elders and people who have knowledge to, yes, be an assistant professor and be paid adequately instead of being some garbage sessional, making like no money and like some garbage position that you just toss to the side. Like it's just so embarrassing when we ask this elder who wants to work so hard with the language. And we're like, well, you could do a 3-3 load and we'll call you a term lecturer. just embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing to be able to, that's a perfect example of how we disclude the community. And we also do that within schooling. We say things like only certified teachers, or only teachers that are recognized, or knowledge or university degrees are recognized by the teacher federations, and so on. Who's going to be part of the education system? It might just be that when we disclude the community, we are discluding Indigenous knowledge and the best Indigenous knowledge that exists out there. Third, Indigenous education encompasses the entirety of experience, aka mystery. And this is where I think the biggest misunderstanding of what Indigenous education talks about, which is that there is no such thing as religion in Indigenous languages. There's no word for it. There's no word for, people have belief systems, like that exists, but like belief in such that I believe this will happen. But like there is no religion, there's spirituality. Now, spirituality is something that's created for Anishinaabe particularly, is about like energy. So it's like you and I get together, someone tells a joke, we laugh. Okay, well, the energy that's created in that is like the spirit of laughter, the spirit of community, the spirit of friendship. So it's like an energy. Spirituality is like an energy that happens when people get together. That's what ceremonies are. That's what songs are. When people come together and they dance and they have a good time and they sing songs and so on, that's energy produced. That's not religion. Like there's no conversion to Anishinaabe. Can't like convert on a Friday. No matter what people, if they, think about the recent scandals involving people who discover their ancestor, they have a grandmother who's Cree or great grandmother. You can't just convert into Anishinaabe or an Indigenous identity of any kind. In fact, that's what's being called out with certain members of the literary and film elite within the country. But you can't convert. What you do is, it's not who you claim, it's who claims you. So that when you create that energy with people, right? You go and you shovel the snow, or you chop the wood, or you do the dishes, then people start to say, oh, you're a part of our community. And pretty soon they call you nephew or niece or cousin, right? And pretty soon they're asking you for $5, right? So that kind of thing. So, you soon enough, you are part of a family, and then people start referring to you as part of that community. And that's like Indigenous citizenship. Pretty soon, then you're adopted. Then you have roles to play within that family. Then you get adopted. You get built into the family network. Sometimes we call that marriage or adoption or whatever that might be. So spirituality is what we have to talk about. So we need to stop this whole idea, this insane idea that Indigenous spirituality in schools somehow compromises people's religion or challenges. In fact, what I say about people's religion, if you're so threatened by a smudge, I think you're not thinking about what it is first, or not understanding what a smudge is, which is an energy building exercise. It's an exercise in which you're saying the earth has value. I want the earth to have relationship with me, and I'll bring it in. What a smudge is it doesn't compromise someone's religion. Maybe perhaps it compromises people's allergies, maybe that, but it doesn't compromise religion. In fact, that says more about the insecurities you have with your own religion than it really has about the smudge itself. That's what it says. Fourth, Indigenous education is process-driven, not product-driven, meaning it's a lifelong process. There's no certification. There's no finish. Because like, at what point is relationship building finished? Like, try that with your spouse. Turn to them tomorrow and say, well, I'm done growing. I know I'll never have to say sorry again. Or I'm done changing. Like, I'm never going to change again. Like, that's why Indigenous education is like about a full lifelong endeavor. And yeah, there's certain times you get roles and therefore more responsibilities, but it might just be that Indigenous education might be the best school of all because there's no finish. We need to stop thinking about there being a finish. And it might just be that when we think about a finish, we are doing the least Indigenous education thing of all. Now, that's why Indigenous education is always about the future, not the past. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about Indigenous peoples from 100 years ago. So that's actually not what it's about. It's about Indigenous peoples gaining teachings from tradition, from intellectual tradition, to be able to turn towards the future. This is the completion rates for Indigenous peoples in schools. Now, no surprise, you are a bunch of deans in education and people who work in administration. You know that Indigenous peoples are not performing well in schools. You know that it's about 20% less. And I'm going to tell you why. Here's the reason why there's so few Indigenous students at graduation. Well, the biggest problem is what I call the formula. This is the formula for Indigenous and, frankly, Canadian student success. This is the formula that we use for all students. We take potential. Every student has potential. We say that. We say every kid has value. Every student can learn. That's what we say. And then second is we add opportunity. That's where we come in. We say, okay, here's the textbook, here's the classroom space, here's the teaching expertise that I have. We're going to give you opportunity. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide that by relevance. Now, relevance is deeply tied to success. Now, those of you who do math, you know that to get potential opportunity, we have to multiply relevance times success. That's where you get the math equation here. But so let's figure out quickly what success is. Success is basically in schooling, did you graduate? Period. There is no mark on the report card for, did this person share well? Was this person nice? Did this person adequately share their privilege with others? Like, there's none of that. Like, that doesn't exist. Every single school that I've ever seen in Canada is all about graduation. It's like, did they finish? That means that our relevancy is only tied to did they finish. So relevancy is like, did they finish the test? Or did they learn the Pythagorean theorem? Did they learn Romeo and Juliet? Like, so relevance is solely based on the question of, does it lead to them graduating? So for example, that's why we have extracurricular activities. So like, for instance, if they played on the football team, that has nothing to do with success. I mean, in theory, it might have something to do with the way in which relevance is determined, but ultimately it's, did they go on the band trip, has nothing to do with success, unless it's about graduation credits, which lead to success. This is an important theory because it leaves Indigenous students out of it. You know, if we say to ourselves, these are the academic indicators of schooling success, did they finish? And that's what we use. Well, notice that we've left Indigenous peoples, or everything Indigenous peoples value, going back to the holistic learning model, like, do they know their nation? Do they know their language? Do they know their clan? Do they know themselves? Do they know their family? Do they know all the things that go into who they are and their ancestors, like their connection with the land itself? Notice that everything that we value as Indigenous peoples has no role within the school system as it exists. Like, for example, if we say to ourselves, okay, well, Indigenous peoples, like, do you need to know, for example, the Anishinaabe creation story to get to a graduation point? No. Why? Because the Native First Nations credit, if that's where it exists, is probably an optional credit. It's probably taught at noon hours or after school, and it's the thing that's most often cut when it comes to people like this guy, who treat Indigenous education like extracurricular, like it's something extra. I have a newsflash for everybody. If you are doing Indigenous education, if you say you're doing it, you're filling it in your schools, you're teaching your teachers to do it and so on, but it can be cut, meaning that if you run out of time, it's not, get to the real core stuff. But like, if Indigenous education is something that can be cut at any time, and that includes in the Faculty of Education, if you can cut your classes, if it's not mandatory, that means you're not doing Indigenous education. Like, if it's not part of every single class, and I'm including, yes, the first year class on history of education. Yes, I'm talking about the class on pedagogy in the third year of psychology. Yes, I did it all, by the way. I did a B.Ed degree. So if Indigenous education is something that can be cut, then you're not doing Indigenous education. So that means Indigenous education has a lot to do with willpower, funding, understanding what it is, resources, fear, all those kinds of things. And it might just be that when we talk about Indigenous education, this is not something that is like, we just need to do it because it's the right thing to do. And I'm not into those arguments of like, it's the right thing to do. I'm here to talk about something really tangible. It is the only thing to do. Here's the reality. Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in the country. Nobody's growing even remotely close as fast to us, not even close. In Manitoba and Winnipeg is the most significant proportional population. We make about 20% of Manitoba, which tells you, Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, Saskatoon, and Thunder Bay, also very close, very high up in terms of 20% of their populations. That means that in those communities, if you cannot work with Indigenous peoples, because 1 out of every 5 clients, people you meet on the street, people you potentially could be married to, every single one of those will be Indigenous, That means that if you can't work with, live beside, or be married to an Indigenous person effectively, positively, you're kind of unemployable. Oh, and by the way, let's look at the red dots in Vancouver, Northern British Columbia, Southern Ontario. You're coming. So this is where I get into a bit of a beef situation in which I know in the major population centers like Toronto, like BC, like Montreal, everyone likes to say, well, you know, Winnipeg's the most racist city in the galaxy, or Edmonton or Thunder Bay, or whoever's decided, whichever Toronto's decided to be the most racist city this week. It might just be that Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Regina, Calgary, Thunder Bay, it might just be not that that is racist, that there isn't racism there. It might just be that Canada has a racism problem, that we see it more in Winnipeg. And second is that we might see the most solutions as the result in those places, that places like Toronto and Vancouver, who frankly have a deep racism problem, Robert Picton, Vancouver, Toronto, the fact you never even talk about Indigenous peoples at all, and fairly, somewhat succeed in the areas of residential school. It might just be that racism exists there too, but that solutions might be looked at in places like the Prairies and Thunder Bay, and you might learn something. Like there might be things that happen within our territories that might actually teach us a lot about reconciliation, just like we in Winnipeg have learned deeply from what's happened in the North. There's a reason why many Inuit people have come down here, and we look to the North, places like Yellowknife, where really radical, interesting stuff have done, like language programs, child welfare initiatives like C92, which have been going back to the 1990s up in the North, and so on and so forth. Like most of the really great ideas in terms of reconciliation, yes, are happening on the prairies now, but previously were learned from other large-scale Indigenous communities like the North. This is where I get into talking a little bit about what it is that we're going to teach kids. What it is that we need to teach then. If we need to stop treating Indigenous content as an optional or something that we do on the noon hour or something that we do after school, or that if we cut it, then therefore we're not doing Indigenous education. Well, then we need to take those 5 principles and use those as guideposts, which are the ones I did right over here, and those 5 principles, and say to ourselves, well, we're really not talking about curriculum anymore. But we are, but it might just be that curriculum is one out of 11 different things we're trying to do. If the school is a social system, I want you to turn to any graduating student and say, what was the best part of your school experience? And I guarantee none of them will say algebra. They won't say Romeo and Juliet. They won't say the theories of Aristotle. None of them will say that. They're going to say my friends, or they might say a teacher, or they might say the hockey team or the band trip or whatever it might be. We teach relationships. We don't teach curriculum. Curriculum is not where it's at. For example, here, let me give you an example. If we decided that Indigenous education was important, if we all said we're all the deans of education in the country, we're all going to make sure Indigenous curriculum is where it's at. We're going to make sure even that there's science and math in it. We don't care what classroom. Every teacher is going to, in their classroom, teach that Indigenous voices matter. We're going to teach it on the test. We're going to teach it in the resources. We're going to buy a bunch of books. We're going to teach that Indigenous voices matter. We're going to make people write on the test. Number 1 question, well, whose voices matter in this unit? And the answer will be Indigenous voices. And you mark that back, you go, check, way to go. 100%, A+. But then the students go into the hallway and they notice something. There's no Indigenous peoples that have power in the building. There's no Indigenous administrators. There's very few Indigenous teachers. There's no Indigenous peoples on posters. There's no Indigenous peoples that make any decisions in the building. And then they look in the office and they go, wow, the office is the epitome of that. There's no Indigenous peoples who make any decisions at all in this place. Or there's no Indigenous leadership. Or there's no Indigenous voices on the intercom. And then they go, okay, well, let me go to the library. And the library, a couple Indigenous resources over here in the corner, but generally most of the resources there talking about anything but Indigenous people. And they go, well, that's kind of like how it is at the supermarket when I look at the magazines, or when I go to the movie store and I look at the movies, or when I go to look at the federal government and I go, wow, there's no Indigenous peoples in government that represent Indigenous peoples. There's Indigenous peoples who represent Canadian political parties. That means that they don't represent Indigenous peoples, they represent Canadians. And occasionally a few Indigenous peoples here and there, not to insult any of the Indigenous MPs who are friends of mine, but to say that they don't represent Indigenous peoples. There's no people who represent Indigenous nations in government. So the library, the office, the hallway kind of looks like society. And you know what the students think? They think, that Indigenous Voices unit that we did, that's a big left-wing lie. My teacher is a social justice nut who's trying to trick me. And then they start saying things like, oh, there's an activist teacher, or that's a teacher who's trying to change my mind or trying to give some fake news, or that's where all that comes from, because we haven't dealt with the hallway, or what I call the post-curriculum world, which is we've obsessed, in fact, on Indigenous curriculum, and importantly so. I'm not saying we should stop that. I'm not saying that there isn't important curriculum out there. I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach about Indigenous history content knowledge in the math class or the ELA class or the social studies class. I'm not saying any of that should stop. Of course it should, but it should arm students or equip students with going to the hallway, because if it doesn't connect with the idea of relationality, which is what happens in the hallway, if we don't deal with the hallway first, and I say, in fact, more so than the content, I'm not actually worried about content. Content's doing pretty good, and generally, that's not actually going to change people's lives. Like memorizing that there was 122 residential schools doesn't change anything. But understanding that what happened in residential school affects the hallway, that's where you get revolutionary stuff. And as I begin to talk about, school policies and counseling, I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky in that I've been able to travel all across this country, and I've been able to see a lot of different things. And I've been able to, go to different schools all across Canada and see all the different initiatives and programs and projects that have happened. I get to go to Halifax and North Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary. And one of the great things about being a recovering teacher is people like hearing talks, about their school system or what it's like to be a teacher, particularly an Indigenous teacher. And so, when I get to talk, I get to go to Yellowknife and all these different things. And arguably, I learned a lot of this from my father, who's a person who is very deeply indebted in education. Here he is right over here. So he's former Senator Murray Sinclair. One of the things that he's famously said is that education got us in this mess. It will be education that brought us out. And in many ways, he prepared me to be a teacher when he was young, although he was very disappointed when I didn't become a lawyer, by the way. But this is the kind of thing that I do now. And when I travel, when I look around and I see that, I work with schools on reconciliation projects. I work with them on areas of how do we embody ourselves within different elements of reconciliation schooling. And the things that I've learned, the thing that I've really learned through all of this experience is that curriculum is not where it's at. It is a part of it, but that if we don't deal with the hallway, the office, and the library, the sports field, the relationships with parents on parent-teacher night, reconciliation is pretty much rudderless. It doesn't happen. It doesn't move. It doesn't change anything. And that you can see here with the projects that I have working on with teachers, I've realized some really basic premises. What I did is I made a big list one day, and I made a big list to say, these are the most successful initiatives for Indigenous and Canadian students. And what I did was I applied the method of asking the students. I said, what were the best things that you enjoyed? And every school I went to, every community I went to, I wrote down what those were. And students said things like transition programs, mentorship, and being involved in leadership and advocacy. When they got to learn about Indigenous pedagogy and having community engagement ceremonies and things like the powwow at the Garden City Collegiate and culturally, yes, they did mention things like curricula. They mentioned things like language programs and traditional knowledge and elders being involved in the school. They mentioned things like having different communities or talking specifically about their own community. They talked about genders and sexuality and clans. They talked about having funding supports and transition to workplaces. Like, noticed how small curriculum is in that. But yet that's the thing that we obsess about at university. The thing we obsess the most about is trying to get our students, our future teachers, to be focused on unit planning, lesson planning. Here's what I've realized. Reconciliation is not, nor will ever be, a lesson plan or a unit plan. Our job is to create teachers who understand that reconciliation is about relationships. And yes, it's not that, of course, it's not that relationships don't matter, but that, it's not that curriculum doesn't matter. It's that we need to figure out ways to have what I boil down to as the 4 successes. The 4 elements of these successful initiatives are based in 4 things. One is relationships. Do students have relationships in all they do? Second, do they have relevancy? But actually, I'm talking about Indigenous relevancy. Did they learn their clan? Did they learn their community? Did they learn their language? And for Canadians, did they learn that they have deep ties to relation to Indigenous peoples, which are fundamental to their identity? Do they understand that they're on Indigenous lands? Do they understand that they are a part of this great, huge fabric of treaty, if they're in their treaty area, or if it's a non-treaty area, that they are in a process of understanding their relationships to each other? Third, do they feel respected? And I think this is the thing that is perhaps lacking the most in our discussions around Indigenous education, which is around just the general conversation on respect. That conversation of respect, is everybody respectful that this is important? Is it everyone understanding that we're not talking about leaving the Ukrainians out? That's the thing I most often, Polish or insert whatever racialized group here or citizenship group here, is that people say, well, what about the insert whatever culture in that? We're not leaving anybody out through this. We're in fact making better relationships within this space by talking about Indigenous education, because it impacts everybody. People from other places of the world come into these relationships. They don't get to circumscribe the whole relationship. And so that's why Indigenous education is so important, because it's really the only thing that talks about everybody. Let me say that again. Indigenous education is really the only thing that talks about everything in this country. British, French, insert whatever other culture, isn't talking about everybody. It's talking about other places. It's talking about Indigenous identity, Indigenous education, Indigenous relationships. That's talking about everybody. Lastly, one of the things that I think is really important for us to understand is that when we're talking about Indigenous education, we're really talking about responsibilities. Like, for instance, when I got my PhD, I thought I was pretty hot stuff. I was like Dr. Sinclair, right? So I thought, pretty excited, got my degree, grabbed my degree, ran to my auntie's house, said, "Hey, Auntie, look, I'm Dr. Sinclair." And she smiled and she looked at me and she said, "Well, congratulations, Dr. Sinclair." And then she went to the closet, opened up, grabbed an axe, said, go chop me some wood there, Dr. Sinclair." And so there I am chopping the wood in the backyard. And she's like, "How's that dissertation coming?" So my point is that my auntie loves me. She respects me. But because I got a PhD, that means I have more responsibility in my community. I'm never not a nephew. I'm never not a son. I'm never not a cousin. And that means that this is the formula for Indigenous and, frankly, all student success. But if we want to deal with graduation rates, this is the formula. First of all, we take respect. Everybody's got to respect and understand this is important. That's where those cultural awareness conversations really need to take place. That's like the first level, basic 101 stuff, which is, this is why we're talking about it. Those are many of the keynotes that I give, by the way, which is like, this is why it's important. And then second is we say, okay, we've still got potential and opportunity. We get that, the same as before. So every student has potential, we give opportunity. But divided by Canadian relevance, does it lead to graduation? Then we also say Indigenous relevance matters too. People should know the language. People should know the clans of this territory. People should know of what's happening, what resources, what are the names, what are the ways in which Indigenous peoples have built relationships with everybody in this territory. And then most importantly for Indigenous students, then we start building in relationships and we say, okay, every teacher brings a relationship that exponentially creates success. Success then becomes not just the graduation, but the realization that as a person in society, as a person in this relationship of treaty, Indigenous or non, is that you now have responsibility. Just like when we hand somebody a drum, that doesn't mean that you then are a drum carrier and you don't play the drum. You gotta go play the drum now. So that means your responsibilities come with your success. So that means that the formula must include the idea that now your job is to create 2 of you or 3 of you or 4 of you. I'm talking about Indigenous peoples. I'm also talking about Canadians as well. Is that Canadians then must go to the Tim Hortons and talk to their uncle and their grandfather about what it means to live in this society. That means that Indigenous peoples, you go back to your community, because not once, not ever has any Indigenous community ever told their students to go away forever. That's residential school. Residential school did that. What we tell our students is you must go home now and chop the wood and do the dishes. And it doesn't matter how many degrees you have, Dr. Sinclair, you're still my nephew. And that means that you still have to contribute, you still have to bring something to the party. Reconciliation is all of those things, and it is everyone coming together in a conversation, in a process, in a lifelong process of moving towards the future. It might just be that this is the method of the future. This is the method in which we will build a much better country in which the one we've inherited. This is the system in which we together will be able to get beyond this very dogmatic, very problematic, and somewhat limiting way in which we see each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, by seeing that we are in relationships permanently together. And that, yes, when children are found in unmarked graves, it's on all of us. Yes, when we see violence in the streets and people saying stereotypical racist things, that's on all of us. And yes, when we see the future, we see that that is a possibility for all of us together. And those who have lived here the longest might just have the greatest solutions of all. With that, I say miigwech, and thank you very much for your time. I appreciate, I don't know quite, it looks like I went a little bit over, but I appreciate your time and your energy and your commitment. And I say a big miigwech to everyone for letting me be a part of this year's Sherman lecture. I have deep admiration and regard for all of you working in the Faculty of Education. I just wish that you made it a little bit easier. And if anybody can change my C+ that I got in educational third year psychology, I would be very thankful.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. My mind is reeling, and you have given us so much to think about, and I've taken a million pictures of the slides. I'm not going to take time to summarize or to thank you sufficiently for what you have given us today, because I do know that we only have a couple of minutes, and I would like to open it up for a couple of questions if possible. So we have, if you could use your virtual hand, and I'm going to go to the chat room to see if I can. Or
comments are fine too. Like, you don't have to feel you have to ask a question. I always feel it's kind of ask a question. No, it's more like if you want to make a comment, go right ahead. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
All right, so we'll open it up, and I'm told that we can go a few minutes over. So please, if you've got a comment or a question, this is a good time. Amanda says, a deep thank you, Dr. Sinclair, for sharing today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, appreciate it, Amanda. And I thought I saw a hand there. Yep.
Jen,
yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. So, so Chimigwach, Niigaan, I just I really liked hearing about our Anishinaabe history, and I always like hearing the language. Being out on the coast, I don't always get to have that, so I appreciate that. I also want to say miigwech for really, giving us a chance to pause and think and about reconciliation and the role of reconciliation, in particular Indigenous education, how you spoke about that today. But I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation, because I think I'm becoming increasingly impatient towards reconciliation, and I appreciate that it has raised awareness of settler colonial histories and really prompted educators and faculties of education to engage perhaps more deeply in reconciliation. But it just simply, I'm joining those other scholars, educators, and those who feel that it simply really hasn't done enough to dismantle, I think, the colonial and normative structures that we find in our education systems. And so, and a question I said, is reconciliation hope or hype? And so what advice, what guidance, what can you share with those of us who are becoming increasingly frustrated and impatient at the pace in which faculties of education, school systems are moving towards reconciliation? Or is it time to move beyond the reconciliation discourse to consider something, something more towards sovereignty, self-determination, the United Nations Declaration, the rights of Indigenous peoples? Where are we going? Where do we go next?
Yeah. So miigwech for that. I can't agree more in that, here's a simple formula that I have for everyone is that if you are still at the point of convincing that relationships with Indigenous peoples is important, and I think, frankly, I'll say 80% of society, 90% of society is still at that point, then the conversation of reconciliation hasn't even started. And that means that if you're still at those points in which you're saying, here's what Indigenous peoples are, here's the terms that we use, or this is what a territorial acknowledgement is. If you ever get to the point where you have to explain all those things, you're not at reconciliation. Because reconciliation is about understanding relationships with each other. And we're simply talking about like, who are Indigenous peoples? That's what I mean when I say that Canadians are not ready for this conversation. And so Canadians have not been thinking about Indigenous peoples because we were locked under reserves still 1960. We were also locked from university until the 1970s. And then now we're being misinterpreted as activists when we're simply standing on our own territories and saying, we, like any nation of the world, have a right to determine what happens on our own nations. You don't get to determine who our leadership is. You don't get to determine what happens on our territory. Oh, and by the way, 99% of the land that you're sitting on is stolen anyways. And so, like, all of those things are what would be deemed as, me being an angry Indian or me saying revolutionary things or violent things and so, like, none of that, like, all of that's me saying, actually, I love you. That's all of what that says, or that we're in this together, and that let's live in a just and wonderful place in which we all have meaning and we all carry lives together. Well, we're supposed to be under things like the treaties. So what I mean is that reconciliation, the conversation hasn't even started. So when people say things like we're in the era of reconciliation, I'm like, not often, like not even in the opening words. What we are in is in the process in which I think Canadians are having to do a steep learning curve, making many mistakes along the way. And you can look at the Prime Minister as a prime example of that, of entering that conversation. But yet, I see a lot of trying. So I also want to, encourage those who are trying and those who are making efforts, that I don't want to abandon them. I want to stand beside them. And I want to say that, listening twice as much before you speak is probably the good method here. And also being patient and kind with yourself and others might be a way in which we can get one day to a conversation of reconciliation. And importantly, reconciliation without returning the land, reconciliation without restitution, reconciliation without the revitalization of our languages, as just a beginning point, is just not reconciliation. But yeah, I'm called a revolutionary for saying those things, which really none of that was revolutionary. That was all just called justice.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. I am cognizant of our time. I've taken a ton of notes, but the image that sticks with me is the image of envisioning a future schooling that has to do with relationships and that is built upon the Indigenous core systems. Your successful initiatives gives us a path forward. Your different mathematical equation for us to think about what success really means, I think, is a way for all of us in education to move forward, Jan, and not to actually do something. And we have an elder in our territory, Imelda Purley, and she says reconciliation doesn't matter, it's reconciliation. It is what we do about it. And I forever thank Imelda and her husband, Dave Purley, for leading us in that path here in New Brunswick and in Fredericton. Walewan, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you everybody for attending, and I wish you all a good conference. And Dr. Sinclair, I'm going to look you up on YouTube and read your column from now on.
Oh, thanks so much. I put my email in. Actually, I think I said miigwech, but I just sent it to one person because but I said miigwech to everybody, and I put my email there. So if you want to, if you have a comment, wasn't comfortable saying it here, or didn't have time or something like that, please send it on over to my email, and I promise to eventually get to it. But you can imagine these days, everything's online. So like who can do anything within a day anymore? We're supposed to be at home working, but now it's like triple busy.
It is. And actually that reminds me that normally we would hand you some tobacco and a gift, and we can't do that. But I can tell you that it's winging its way to you in Manitoba.
Oh, miigwech, thank you so much, everybody. Huge honor for me. I want you to know this was probably one of the most exciting moments of my life when I got the email, I think 2 years ago now, to be asked to do this lecture. So I'm very sorry we couldn't have done it last year with the pandemic, but I just want you to know that I really am very honored that you selected me. So miigwech, everybody. Much love. Giga Waban Miniwak Gizagin, all especially to my friends who I made a shout out at the beginning. I wish I could see you all. And when we see each other, we shall all have a big non-socially distanced hug. So here you go. Miigwech.
Thank you. That's a great way to end. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks. Enjoy your conference.